This is HOA busted. She said it never happened and I had the timestamp. You are about to get a same-day notice, Virginia shouted across the driveway, waving a laminated sheet like it was a warrant. Karen shouted that the HOA attorney already agreed with her and that was the end of the conversation. I stood there with my coffee cup still in hand, because I had run outside so fast I forgot to set it down. I work nights as a firefighter on rotating shifts in Fargo, North Dakota, and I need my sleep window. Virginia Cooper, the Fines and Enforcement Coordinator for Prairie Crossing Homeowners Association, had just decided my sleep window was her prime enforcement time. She was standing at the curb with a roll of caution tape in one hand and a clipboard in the other, yelling about a vendor invoice that made no sense and refusing to explain why it appeared in the budget under my address. I asked her to show me the covenant section. She yanked out a phone and started scrolling, then stopped and said the page number did not matter because the board already voted. I said I wanted to see the minutes. She said the minutes were not public until they were approved, which could take months. I said that was not how open records worked in North Dakota. She said, "You do not get an opinion, you get a fine schedule." That was when I realized this was not the first time. 2 years ago, my neighbor got hit with a phantom towing fee and a lien threat. He fought it for 6 months and eventually just paid to make it stop. The same vendor invoice, the same enforcement coordinator, the same refusal to show the page. I had thought it was bad luck. Now I was looking at the same playbook, and Virginia was holding the same clipboard. I told her I was not paying anything until I saw the actual rule and the actual board vote. She slapped a notice on my windshield, ripped off the backing and pressed it down so hard the adhesive smeared. She said the tow vendor was already en route, and I had 30 minutes to move the vehicle or provide proof of compliance. I asked what compliance looked like. She said that was between me and the management company, and she walked away still holding the tape like she was ready to cordon off my entire driveway. I went inside and pulled up the HOA portal. My account showed 0 violations. I checked my email. Nothing. I checked the physical mailbox. Nothing. The notice on my windshield had today's date but referenced a case number I had never seen. I called the management company. The woman who answered said she would look into it and get back to me. I said the tow truck was coming in less than 30 minutes. She said she could not override an enforcement action without board approval. I asked who approved it. She said Virginia Cooper was the enforcement coordinator, and that was her authority. I hung up and started looking through my old emails. I found the neighbor's name, pulled up his contact, and sent a text asking if he still had any of the paperwork from his case. He replied in under a minute, "I saved everything, come over." I grabbed my keys and my phone and went next door. His name was Marcus. He was standing on his porch holding a thick binder. He said, "I knew this would come back. I knew she was running a scam. I just could not prove it." He handed me the binder and I started flipping through it. Notices with dates that did not line up. Vendor invoices that had identical line items but different case numbers. Meeting minutes that referenced votes I could not find in any earlier minutes. And then I saw it. A records request denial that cited a policy they would not show him. I asked Marcus if he ever got the actual covenant page. He said no. I asked if he ever got the meeting minutes where the vote happened. He said no. I asked if he ever got a hearing. He said yes, but it was a closed session and they told him he could not record it. I asked what the outcome was. He said they upheld the fine, added administrative fees, and threatened a lien. He paid it because he could not afford a lawyer. I took photos of every page in the binder with my phone. I told Marcus I was reopening this. He said, "Be careful, she has the management company and the tow vendor in her pocket. She will make your life hell." I said she already was. I got back to my house just as the tow truck pulled up. The driver got out and walked over. I asked him who called for the tow. He said Prairie Crossing HOA. I asked him if he had a signed authorization. He pulled out a folded paper with a stamp on it. I asked to see it. He hesitated, then handed it over. The signature line was blank. The stamp said Prairie Crossing Homeowners Association, but there was no name, no title, and no date except the printed form date. I told him this was not a valid authorization. He said he was just doing his job, and if I had a problem I needed to call his dispatch. I said, let us call them together. He looked uncomfortable, but he pulled out his phone and dialed. I could hear the dispatcher answer. The driver explained the situation. The dispatcher asked if there was a signed authorization. The driver said no. The dispatcher said he could not proceed without one and to return to base. Virginia came running across the street. She was yelling before she even reached us. She said the authorization was already filed and the driver was wasting time. The driver said his dispatch just told him to return. Virginia said she would call his supervisor. The driver said, "Go ahead," and he got back in his truck. Virginia turned to me and said, "You think you are clever, but you are just delaying the inevitable." I said, "Show me the signed authorization." She said, "It is in the file." I said, "Then get it." She said, "I do not owe you access to internal documents." I said, "You owe me due process." She said, "Your camera does not matter. My minutes are the truth." I wrote that down. I had a small notepad in my back pocket, and I pulled it out and wrote down every word. Because later, I planned to read them back to her. The pages were a little wet from sweat, but I kept writing. She saw me writing, and she got louder. She said I was harassing her and she was going to file a complaint with the board. I said, "Go ahead, I am filing one too." She stomped back across the street. The tow truck left. I went back inside and started drafting a formal records request. I requested every meeting minute from the last 3 years, every enforcement action filed under my address, every vendor contract, and every communication between the board and the management company regarding my case. I submitted it through the portal and saved a screenshot of the timestamp. 2 days later, I got a response. The management company said my request was denied because it was overly broad and would create an undue burden. I replied asking them to cite the specific statute or policy that allowed them to deny a records request on those grounds. They did not respond. I called the North Dakota Attorney General's office and asked about open records laws for HOAs. The clerk told me that HOAs were required to provide records to members within a reasonable time, and that overly broad was not a valid reason for denial unless the request was truly impossible to fulfill. She said I could file a complaint or I could retain an attorney. I said I would start with a complaint. I filed the complaint online. The form asked for supporting documents. I attached the screenshots of my records request, the denial, and my follow-up. I also attached photos of the notice on my windshield, the unsigned tow authorization, and 3 pages from Marcus's binder showing identical vendor invoices under different case numbers. The next morning I got an email from the HOA attorney. It was addressed to all homeowners. It said the board had been made aware of frivolous records requests and reminded everyone that abusing the records process could result in fines under the nuisance clause. It did not name me, but it was obvious. I forwarded the email to the AG complaint portal and added a note saying this looked like retaliation. Then I sent a copy to Marcus. He replied, "They did the same thing to me. That is how they bury you." I started looking at the vendor invoices more closely. Every single one had the same format. Same font, same line items, same layout. But the case numbers were different and the dates were different. I pulled up the HOA budget that was posted on the portal. The vendor was listed as a preferred contractor. I looked up the company name online. Their website showed they did towing, but they also did property management and code enforcement consulting. I called them. A woman answered. I said I was a homeowner in Prairie Crossing and I wanted to confirm a service invoice. She asked for the case number. I gave her the one from my windshield notice. She put me on hold. When she came back, she said there was no active case under that number. I asked her to check again. She said she was looking at their system and the case number did not exist. I asked her if Prairie Crossing was a client. She said yes. I asked her how authorizations worked. She said they required a signed form from an authorized board member or management company representative. I asked if Virginia Cooper was authorized. She paused, then said she could not discuss client details. I thanked her and hung up. I had just confirmed that the case number on my notice was fake. That meant Virginia had printed a notice using a fake case number, slapped it on my windshield, and called a tow truck without a valid authorization. That was fraud. I called Marcus again. I asked him to check his binder for case numbers. He read off 3. I wrote them down and called the vendor back. Different person answered. I went through the same process. 2 of the 3 case numbers did not exist. The third one existed, but it was closed 2 years ago, and the address did not match Marcus's house. I now had proof that Virginia was generating fake case numbers and fake notices. I also had proof that the vendor invoices in the budget were tied to cases that did not exist. I started pulling meeting minutes from the portal. I wanted to see when the vendor contract was approved and who voted for it. The contract appeared in the minutes from 18 months ago. The vote was unanimous. But the minutes did not show who was present. I requested the attendance log. The management company said attendance logs were not public records. I said the open meetings law required attendance to be recorded. They said I could request it in writing. I said I already did. They stopped responding. I decided to go to the management company office in person. It was a small office in a strip mall on the south side of Fargo. I walked in and asked to speak to someone about my records request. The receptionist said everyone was in a meeting. I said I would wait. She said it could be a while. I sat down. 30 minutes later, a woman came out. She introduced herself as the assistant manager. I explained my situation. She said she was aware of my request and it was being reviewed. I said it had been reviewed and denied, and I wanted to know why. She said the request was overly broad. I said I had narrowed it and resubmitted twice, and still got denied. She said she would look into it. I said I wanted to look into it with her, right now. She hesitated, then said she could pull my file. She went to a back room and came back with a thin folder. She opened it and flipped through a few pages. She said my account showed no violations. I said that was what the portal showed, but Virginia Cooper had issued a notice and called a tow truck. She frowned and said she did not have a record of that. I showed her the photo of the notice on my windshield. She looked at the case number and said it was not in their system. I asked her who authorized Virginia to issue notices. She said Virginia was the enforcement coordinator and she had authority to issue courtesy notices, but formal violations required board approval. I said this was not a courtesy notice, it threatened towing. She said that should not have happened without board approval. I asked her to check if there was board approval. She clicked through her computer and said there was no approval on file. I asked her if she could pull the vendor contract. She said that was a board document and she would need authorization. I said I was a homeowner and I had a right to see contracts paid with my dues. She said she understood, but she still needed authorization. I said, from who? She said, from the board president or the enforcement coordinator. I said, you mean Virginia Cooper? She nodded. I thanked her and left. I now knew that Virginia controlled access to the documents that would prove she was running a scam. I also knew that the management company was either complicit or scared of her. I went back to Marcus's house and showed him what I had found. He said, she has been doing this for years. The last board president tried to audit her and she got him voted out. I asked how. He said she packed the annual meeting with proxies. I asked where the proxies came from. He said nobody knew, but suddenly there were 30 proxy votes and they all voted the same way. I asked Marcus if he still had any proxies. He said no, but he knew someone who did. He gave me a name and an address. I drove over that afternoon. The woman's name was Linda. She was a retired teacher and she had lived in Prairie Crossing since it was built. She invited me in and made coffee. I explained what was happening. She said, "Virginia is a cancer. She has been manipulating votes and records for years. Nobody can stop her because she controls the proxies, and the management company is afraid to cross her." I asked Linda if she had any old proxies. She went to a closet and pulled out a box. She said, "I kept everything because I knew someone would need it eventually." She handed me a stack of proxy forms. I flipped through them. They were all signed by people I did not recognize. I asked Linda if she knew any of the names. She said no, and neither did anyone else. She said Virginia claimed they were absentee homeowners, but nobody had ever seen them at a meeting or on the property. If you are enjoying this investigation, hit that like button and subscribe for more HOA justice stories. I took photos of every proxy form. I asked Linda if she would be willing to testify if it came to that. She said absolutely. I thanked her and left. I now had 3 pieces of evidence: fake case numbers, fake vendor invoices, and fake proxies. But I still did not have the smoking gun. I needed something that directly tied Virginia to the fraud. I needed her to make a mistake. I decided to bait her. I sent an email to the board through the portal. I said I had reviewed the vendor contract and I noticed discrepancies between the invoices and the contract terms. I said I was requesting a full audit of all vendor payments for the last 3 years. I copied the management company and the HOA attorney. Virginia responded within an hour. She said my request was outside the scope of my homeowner rights and that financial audits required a majority vote of the membership. I replied saying that North Dakota law allowed any homeowner to request an audit if there was evidence of financial misconduct. I said I had evidence. She replied saying I was making defamatory accusations and I needed to retract them immediately or face legal action. I did not retract. Instead, I filed a second complaint with the AG, this time specifically alleging financial fraud and election fraud. I attached the proxy forms, the vendor invoices, the fake case numbers, and the email thread with Virginia. The next day, I got a certified letter. It was from the HOA attorney. It said the board had voted to fine me $500 for filing a frivolous complaint and another $500 for defamation. It said I had 10 days to pay or the fines would be added to my account and could result in a lien. I took the letter to a lawyer. His name was Tom and he specialized in HOA disputes. He read the letter and said, "This is retaliation and it is illegal." He said he could represent me but it would cost money. I said, "How much?" He said, "A few thousand to start." I said I did not have that. He said, "Then you need to fight this yourself, but you need to be smart about it." He gave me some advice and sent me on my way. I went home and started drafting a response to the fine letter. I said the fines were retaliatory and that I had evidence of financial and election fraud. I said I was requesting a formal hearing with a neutral hearing officer as required by North Dakota law. I sent the response certified mail and posted a copy to the portal. Virginia called me that night. She said, "You are making a huge mistake. You do not know who you are messing with." I said, "I know exactly who I am messing with. A fraud." She said, "You are about to lose your house." I said, "We will see." She hung up. The next morning, Marcus texted me. He said, "Check the portal." I logged in. There was a new post. It was a notice saying the annual meeting had been moved up to next week, and that all homeowners were required to attend or submit a proxy. The notice also said there would be a vote on a special assessment to cover legal fees related to frivolous complaints. I called Marcus. I said, "She is trying to ram through a special assessment to cover the cost of fighting my complaint. he said, and she is going to use proxies to pass it. I said, not if I can prove the proxies are fake. I spent the next 3 days going door to door. I knocked on every house in the neighborhood and asked if they had submitted a proxy. Most people said no. A few said they had submitted one years ago but had not been contacted since. Nobody had submitted one for this meeting. I compiled a list of every homeowner I spoke to and their responses. I also pulled the HOA bylaws and found the section on proxies. It said proxies had to be submitted in writing and had to include the homeowner's signature address and the specific meeting date. It also said proxies could not be used for more than one meeting without being resubmitted. I now had proof that Virginia's proxies were invalid, but I still needed to prove she was the one submitting them. I needed the smoking gun. Then I got it. I was scrolling through my email and I saw a message I had missed. It was from the portal system. It was an automated notification saying my records request had been fulfilled. I clicked the link. It took me to a download page. I clicked download and opened the file. It was a zip file with hundreds of documents: meeting minutes, vendor invoices, contracts, emails, and proxy forms. I started going through them. Most of it was routine. But then I found something. A folder labeled Portal Audit Log. I opened the audit log. It was a spreadsheet showing every action taken on the portal for the last 3 years. Uploads, downloads, deletions, and edits. I scrolled through it. Most of the activity was routine. But then I saw it. A series of deletions. All on the same day. All under my account. I looked at the timestamps. The deletions happened 2 days after I submitted my first records request. The files that were deleted were my original compliance uploads, the ones I had submitted when I first moved in. Virginia had deleted them and then issued a notice saying I was out of compliance. I checked the audit log for Marcus's account. Same thing, deletions 2 years ago, right before he got hit with the fake towing notice. I now had the smoking gun. A portal audit log showing Virginia had deleted records after they were submitted and then used the missing records as justification for enforcement actions. That was fraud. And it was documented. I called Marcus. I said, I got her. He said, what do you have? I said, proof she deleted our records and framed us. He said, bring it to the meeting. I said, I am bringing it to the meeting and I am bringing copies for everyone. The meeting was 3 days away. I spent those 3 days printing copies of everything. The audit log, the fake case numbers, the fake proxies, the vendor invoices, the email threads. I printed 50 copies of each and put them in binders. The night of the meeting, I showed up early. The meeting was in the community center, a small building at the front of the neighborhood. I walked in with a box full of binders. Virginia was already there, standing at the front with a laptop and a projector. She saw me, and her face went red. She said, "You cannot bring materials into the meeting without prior approval." I said, "These are public records. I am distributing them to the membership." She said, "You are disrupting the meeting." I said, "The meeting has not started yet." People started arriving. I handed out binders as they walked in. Most people looked confused. A few people thanked me. Virginia kept yelling that I was violating meeting procedures. I ignored her. At 7 o'clock, the meeting started. Virginia called it to order. She said the first item was the vote on the special assessment. I stood up and said, "Point of order." She said, "You do not have the floor." I said, "I am requesting a hearing on the fines issued against me." She said, "That is not on the agenda." I said, "North Dakota law requires a hearing before fines can be enforced." She said the board already voted. I said the board cannot vote without giving me a hearing. She slammed a gavel on the table. She said, "You are out of order." I said, "No, you are out of order. And I can prove it." I walked to the front and opened my binder. I said, Everyone in this room needs to see this. I held up the audit log. I said this is a portal audit log. It shows that Virginia Cooper deleted records from the HOA portal after they were submitted by homeowners. She then used the missing records as justification for issuing fake violations and fake fines. Virginia said, "That is a lie." I said, "It is right here." I pointed to the screen. I said, "These timestamps show deletions under my account and under Marcus's account. Both deletions happened right before we were issued notices." She said, "That is not proof." I said, "It is proof of fraud." Linda stood up. She said, "I have been saying this for years. Virginia has been manipulating records and votes, and nobody would listen. Thank you for finally proving it." Virginia said, "This meeting is over." She tried to close her laptop. I said, "No, this meeting is not over. We are voting on whether to remove you as enforcement coordinator." She said, "You cannot do that." I said, "Yes, we can. Bylaws Section 12. Any officer can be removed by a majority vote of the membership present." Virginia pulled out her phone. She said, "I am calling the attorney." I said, "Go ahead. Call him. Let him see the audit log. Let him explain how you are going to defend fraud charges." Someone in the back shouted, "I move to remove Virginia Cooper as enforcement coordinator." Someone else shouted, "I second." Virginia said, "This is not a valid motion." I said, "It is valid and we are voting now." All in favor. Nearly every hand in the room went up. Virginia looked around. Her face went from red to white. She said, "This is not legal." I said, "It is legal and it is done. You are removed. Effective immediately." She grabbed her laptop and her roll of caution tape and walked out. The door slammed behind her. The room was silent for a moment. Then someone started clapping. Then everyone started clapping. I said, "We are not done." I held up the proxy forms. I said, "These are fake proxies that Virginia used to control votes. I am submitting a formal complaint to the North Dakota Attorney General for election fraud. I am also requesting a full financial audit of all vendor payments. If anyone else has been targeted by Virginia, please come talk to me after the meeting." 10 people came up to me. They all had stories. Fake notices. Fake fines. Fake case numbers. I took notes. I told them I would include their cases in the complaint. The next week, I got a call from the Attorney General's office. They said they were opening an investigation into Prairie Crossing Homeowners Association. They said they would be interviewing board members, management company staff, and homeowners. They said Virginia Cooper was being investigated for fraud, election fraud, and abuse of authority. A month later, the HOA held a special meeting. A neutral hearing officer was appointed to review all pending enforcement actions. My fines were dismissed. Marcus's fines were refunded. The vendor contract was terminated. The HOA was required to publish clear enforcement standards and timelines to all homeowners, and all future enforcement actions had to be approved by the full board in an open meeting. Virginia tried to appeal. She submitted a packet of staged photos claiming my car had been parked illegally for months. But the hearing officer compared the timestamps on the photos to the weather records and proved they were taken on the same day, just from different angles. Karen's staged photos got used against her. Virginia withdrew her appeal. At the next board meeting, Virginia showed up one last time. She tried to read a prepared statement. The new board president cut her off and said she was no longer recognized as an officer and she needed to leave. She said, "You do not get an opinion, you get a fine schedule." The president said, "No, you get a restraining order if you do not leave." Virginia left. The investigation concluded 6 months later. The Attorney General issued a report finding that Virginia had engaged in systematic fraud, election fraud, and abuse of authority. She was banned from serving on any HOA board in North Dakota. The management company was fined for failing to supervise her. The vendor was dropped from the preferred contractor list. I kept the binder. I added the final report, the hearing officer's decision, and the new enforcement standards. I gave a copy to Marcus. He said, "You did it. You actually did it." I said, "We did it. This was your evidence that started it." He said, "No. You reopened the case. I just saved the paperwork." I said, "That is all it takes. One person who will not let it go." Prairie Crossing is quieter now. The new board publishes meeting minutes on time. Enforcement actions go through proper channels. The portal audit log is public. And nobody has seen Virginia in over a year. I still work nights. I still need my sleep window. But now when I come home, I do not have to worry about a fake notice on my windshield or a tow truck in my driveway. I just park, go inside, and get some rest. I hope your neighborhood stays drama-free.